I'm recording this now because the silence has returned. That's the thing nobody understands. It's not the noise that wears you down, it's the quiet that follows. For 3 nights, there was nothing. No wind in the ponderosas, no call of the whip-poor will, not even the scuttling of mice in the walls of this old cabin. It's a dead quiet, a heavy, listening quiet. And I know, with a certainty that has settled deep in my bones, that it's about to break. The logbook is full, the photographs are fading, and my word, I've come to realize, is worthless to anyone but me. So I'm putting it on tape. Because when they find this place empty, I want there to be a record. I want someone to know that I didn't just wander off. I was waited for. It all started 7 years ago, in the autumn of my 63rd year. My wife, Eleanor, had been gone for 2 winters by then, and the quiet of our suburban home in Flagstaff had become a different kind of oppressive. It was the quiet of absence. So when the lawyer's letter came about my grandfather's old homestead, the one tucked away on a forgotten parcel bordering the Coconino National Forest, it felt like a lifeline. He'd left it to me, the last of his line, 40 acres of pine and rock and a cabin built from the same timber that surrounded it. I was a retired land surveyor. The wild was my language, the grid of a map my scripture. I understood boundaries, property lines, the lay of the land. I thought I understood its rules. For the first year, it was a kind of paradise. The work was hard, honest work. I replaced the roof, chinked on the logs, cleared the overgrown path to the creek. My companion in this was Gus, a German shepherd with more sense than most people I've known. He was a good dog, steady and calm. We had a routine. Mornings, we'd walk the perimeter of the property. I'd carry my old Remington 700, more out of habit than necessity, and Gus would trot ahead, his nose cataloging the night's traffic of deer, elk, and the occasional coyote. The air was thin and clean, smelling of pine sap and damp earth. The sounds were a symphony of normalcy, the chatter of Steller's jays, the distant bugle of a bull elk in the rut, the sigh of the wind through the vast stands of pine. I knew the patterns of the local wildlife intimately. I knew the black bear that favored the berry bushes by the South Ridge would be gone by late October. I knew the deer trails were most active an hour after dawn and an hour before dusk. I knew the precise pitch and rhythm of the coyote packs that yipped and howled from the distant mesas. This place had a pulse, a predictable natural rhythm, and for a while, my own pulse fell into sync with it. I was healing. The first discordant note came on a Tuesday in mid-November. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the air had the sharp bite of impending winter. Gus and I were on our morning patrol along the western fence line. It was a 5-foot-high, heavy-gauge sheep wire fence my grandfather had installed 60 years prior, strung between thick lodgepole pine posts. It was meant more as a suggestion than a true barrier, a line on a map made real, but it was sturdy. I'd checked the entire length of it when I first moved in, reinforcing posts and tightening loose wires. On this particular morning, Gus stopped dead about 200 yards from the westernmost corner post. The fur on his neck bristled. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound I had never heard him make. It wasn't his "I see a squirrel" bark or his "coyote on the ridge" warning. This was a sound of deep, instinctual wrongness. I followed his gaze to the fence. A 20-foot section of it was mangled, not just down, but utterly destroyed. I walked closer, my boots crunching on the pine needles, and the scene only became more baffling. The top strand of wire, thick as my little finger, had been snapped clean in 2 places. The wire mesh below it was peeled back, rolled up on itself like the lid of a tin can. The force required to do that was immense. My first thought was a fallen tree, but there were no downed trees nearby, no broken branches, no sign of impact. The 2 sturdy pine posts that had framed the section were shattered, not at the base where rot might have weakened them, but 3 feet up. The wood was splintered outwards, as if from a massive outward push. I knelt and ran my hand over the torn wire. It was cold and stiff. Not cut. Torn. I'm a surveyor. I deal in facts, in measurements, in the physical laws that govern the world. I took out my pocket tape. The break in the top wire was exactly 38 inches above the ground. The peeled back section of mesh was 12 feet long. I looked for tracks. Bear, I thought. A very large, very angry black bear. But the ground was a hard-packed carpet of needles and duff, and it hadn't rained in weeks. There were no clear impressions, just scuffs and disturbances that told me nothing. Still, a bear was the only logical explanation. A big one, maybe caught in the wire, had panicked and thrashed its way through. It was plausible. Barely. But it didn't feel right. A bear would have clawed and bitten, leaving gouges in the posts and likely hair on the wire. There was nothing, just the clean, brutal damage. And Gus, who had seen bears before and treated them with a healthy but manageable respect, refused to get within 50 feet of the spot. He just stood there, whining softly, his tail tucked tight between his legs. I took a few photographs with the small digital camera I carried in my pack, logged the date and location in my maintenance journal, and spent the rest of the afternoon patching the fence with new wire and fresh posts. I told myself it was a bear, a freak event. But as I worked, a strange feeling settled over me. The woods felt different. The familiar sounds were muted, and the air was still. It felt like the forest was holding its breath. For the next 2 weeks, life returned to a semblance of normal. I tried to put the incident out of my mind, chalking it up to the unpredictable nature of the wild. But a seed of unease had been planted. I started carrying the Remington with a round in the chamber, the safety on. I paid more attention to the small details, the subtle shifts in my environment. Gus remained skittish. He stopped wanting to do the full perimeter walk, often pulling back towards the cabin when we neared the western fence. At night, he took to sleeping pressed against my bedroom door instead of on his bed in the main room. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find him sitting up, ears erect, staring at the darkened window. He was listening to something I couldn't hear. Then came the vocalizations. The first time I heard it, I was cleaning my rifle at the kitchen table just after dusk. It was a moonless, star-dusted night. The sound came from deep in the forest, far to the north. It wasn't a howl, not like a coyote or a wolf. It was a long, drawn-out cry that started as a low, resonant growl and climbed in pitch to something that sounded horribly like a human scream, before descending back into a guttural rumble. It was a sound of profound agony or terrifying rage, and it echoed through the pines for a good 10 seconds before fading. Every hair on my body stood on end. Gus, who had been dozing by the hearth, shot to his feet, a volley of panicked barks erupting from him before he fell silent, trembling. I went to the door, rifle in hand, and listened. The forest was utterly silent. The crickets had stopped. The owls were quiet. That dead, listening silence had fallen again. I tried to rationalize it. A mountain lion? Their screams can sound unnervingly human. But I've heard cougars before. This was different, deeper, more powerful, with a complex, almost linguistic quality to it. It was a sound that did not belong to any animal I knew. It happened again 3 nights later, this time closer. Close enough that I could feel the vibration of it in the floorboards of the cabin. Gus didn't bark this time. He just whimpered and tried to cram himself under the kitchen table. I started a new section in my logbook, titled Anomalous Events. I described the sound, the time, the direction, my own reaction, the dog's reaction. The surveyor in me needed to document, to create a record, to impose order on what felt like encroaching chaos. I decided it was time for more proactive measures. I had 2 old Bushnell trail cameras from my hunting days. Their resolution was poor by modern standards, only 8 megapixels, and the night vision was a grainy black and white affair, but they were better than nothing. I put fresh batteries in them and mounted one overlooking the repaired section of fence and the other on a game trail that led from the creek up towards the north ridge, in the direction the sounds had come from. A week passed. I checked the cameras every morning. The first few days yielded nothing but blurry images of deer passing in the night and a very clear shot of a raccoon meticulously washing its paws in the creek. I was starting to feel foolish, like an old man letting his isolation get the better of him. Then, on the 8th day, I pulled the SD card from the camera on the game trail. There were 34 pictures from the previous night. The first 33 were of a doe and her fawn lingering by the water. The 34th picture, time-stamped at 2:17 a.m., was different. It was mostly black, triggered by something just at the edge of the infrared sensor's range. In the bottom left corner of the frame, partially obscured by a fern, was a leg. It was long, muscular, and covered in what looked like dark matted fur. But it wasn't the leg of a deer or an elk. It was bent at the knee in a way that was distinctly, unnervingly humanoid. And at the bottom of the frame, there was a foot, or what looked like a foot. It was long and narrow, with visible clawed toes, but it was planted flat on the ground, heel down, in a way no four-legged animal walks. I stared at that grainy, low-resolution image for an hour, my coffee going cold in my hand. It was just a fragment, a piece of a puzzle I couldn't see. But it was enough. The methodical part of my brain took over. I printed the photo, dated it, and placed it in the logbook. The rationalizations were growing thin, wearing away like soft stone under a persistent cold rain. The sensory anomalies began to escalate. A smell would come and go on the wind, a rank, cloying odor of wet fur, rot, and something acrid, like musk. It was a predator smell, but heavier and more foul than a bear or a coyote. It would hang in the air for a few minutes and then vanish as quickly as it came. And the feeling of being watched became a near-constant companion whenever I was outside. It was a physical sensation, a pressure at the back of my neck, a prickling of the skin that made me stop what I was doing and slowly scan the dense, shadowed tree line. I never saw anything, but I knew something was there. The woods were no longer a place of solace. They had become a wall, a curtain, behind which something intelligent and hostile was observing me. The day I found the tracks was the day my unease finally curdled into genuine fear. I had followed the creek further downstream than usual, checking for beaver activity. The rains had come the night before, leaving the sandy banks soft and receptive, and there, pressed deep into the mud, was a line of prints. My blood ran cold. They were huge, at least 16 inches long. They were canine in shape, with a large, tri-lobed heel pad and 4 distinct toes tipped with deep claw marks. But the pattern was utterly wrong. They were laid out in a single file, one after the other, with a stride that I measured at nearly 6 feet. It was a bipedal gait, an animal that walked on 2 legs, not a bear which shuffles and ambles, leaving a wide, splayed track pattern. This was the track of something that walked like a man but had the feet of a wolf. I felt a wave of dizziness. This was impossible. This broke the rules. I hurried back to the cabin, my heart hammering against my ribs, and returned with a bag of plaster of Paris and my camera. I photographed the tracks from every angle, placing a 6-inch ruler next to them for scale. Then, with trembling hands, I mixed the plaster and poured a perfect cast of the clearest print. As I waited for it to set, I stood up and looked around. The silence was absolute. The creek seemed to have stopped murmuring. I felt 1,000 unseen eyes on me. I grabbed the cast as soon as it was hard enough to move, not even waiting for it to fully cure, and all but ran back to the cabin, the heavy, damp weight of it cold in my hands. That night, I bolted the door, shuttered the windows, and sat in the dark with the plaster cast on the table in front of me and the Remington across my lap. The intellectual puzzle was over. I was being hunted. The first direct sighting happened 2 weeks later. It was late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to dip below the western ridge, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple. A storm was rolling in, and the air was thick and heavy with the smell of ozone and wet pine. Gus started barking frantically from the front porch, a high, panicked sound that was pure terror. I grabbed the rifle and went to the door, my heart a cold lump in my chest. I opened it a crack and peered out. Gus was at the bottom of the porch steps, his body rigid, staring intently at the edge of the woods, about 100 yards away. I followed his gaze, scanning the deep shadows between the ancient ponderosas. At first I saw nothing. Then something moved. It stepped from behind the thick trunk of a pine, and for a moment my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. It was tall, impossibly tall. It had to be at least 7, maybe 7.5 feet. It stood on 2 long, powerfully muscled legs that were bent backwards at the knee like a dog's. Its torso was lean but broad at the shoulders, covered in shaggy, dark brown fur that was matted with pine needles and dirt. Its arms were long, ending in what looked like massive clawed hands. But it was the head that broke my reality. It was the head of a wolf or a dog with a long snout, pointed ears, and a thick ruff of fur around its neck. It was standing there, perfectly still, its head slightly cocked as if it were studying the cabin, studying me. We were locked in this silent tableau for what felt like an eternity, but was probably no more than 30 seconds. The wind picked up, rustling the trees, and a low growl rumbled from the creature's chest, a sound so deep I felt it in my own sternum. Then, its eyes caught the last rays of the setting sun. They glowed with a sickening, internal luminescence, a flash of amber yellow that held no reflection, only a cold, predatory intelligence. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching it. It took one slow step back, then another, and with a speed that seemed impossible for its size, it turned and melted back into the forest, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. It didn't run. It just vanished. I stood there, frozen, the rifle feeling like a child's toy in my hands. Gus was whimpering at my feet. The first fat drops of rain began to fall. The illusion of my safety was shattered. I was no longer a man in his home. I was prey in my den, and the predator knew exactly where I lived. That night was the longest of my life. The storm broke with a vengeance, the wind howling around the eaves of the cabin and the rain lashing against the windows like handfuls of thrown gravel. I barricaded the door with a heavy oak bookshelf and closed all the solid wood shutters over the windows, plunging the cabin into near total darkness, save for the flickering light of a single kerosene lamp. Gus refused to leave my side, pressing his body against my leg, his whole frame shaking with a continuous low tremor. Around 10 o'clock, the sound started. It began with a heavy thud against the north wall of the cabin, like someone had thrown a log against it. Gus let out a choked yelp. I grabbed the Remington, my knuckles white, and positioned myself in the center of the room, trying to cover both the door and the two windows. Then came the scratching. A slow, deliberate scraping sound on the shutter of the west-facing window, the one that looked out towards the mangled fence line. It wasn't the frantic scratching of an animal. It was methodical, deliberate, the sound of claws, thick and hard, testing the wood. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. Pause. My blood was roaring in my ears. I could hear my own ragged breathing. The scratching stopped, and a new sound began. A low, wet, snuffling noise right at the base of the door. It was sniffing, smelling, gathering information. I could almost feel its breath seeping through the cracks in the old wood. Then, the doorknob began to jiggle. Slowly at first, then more violently. It was turning the knob back and forth, testing the lock. My mind reeled. A bear couldn't do that. No animal could do that. This was intelligence. This was a creature trying to solve the problem of how to get inside. The jiggling stopped. There was a moment of silence, a silence so profound it was more terrifying than the noise. I held my breath, straining to hear over the storm and the frantic beating of my own heart. And then came the impact. A massive, concussive blow struck the door, shaking the entire cabin. The frame groaned in protest. Dust rained down from the rafters. Gus screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Another blow landed, even harder than the first. The heavy oak door bowed inward. I could hear the wood splintering. I raised the rifle to my shoulder, the brass bead of the front sight wavering in the lamplight. I aimed at the center of the door. If it came through, I would shoot. I had no other choice. The third blow never came. Instead, I heard heavy, plodding footsteps on the porch. They moved from the door to the window, then back again. The creature was circling, pacing, like a shark testing a cage. It was walking on 2 feet. I could hear the distinct heel-toe rhythm of its steps. For what felt like hours, it patrolled the perimeter of the cabin. It would stop at each window, and I would hear that same awful snuffling sound, sometimes accompanied by a low, frustrated growl. It was testing my defenses, learning my fortress. It was a siege. Sometime after midnight, the sounds on the porch ceased. I waited, every muscle tensed, for what seemed like an eternity. The storm began to die down, the rain softening to a steady drizzle. I stayed awake until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shutters. Only then did I allow myself to lower the rifle. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained, but I knew I had survived the night. When the sun was fully up, I cautiously unbolted the door and peered outside. The porch was covered in muddy 5-toed tracks, each one bearing the deep impression of claws. There were long, deep gouges in the door and the window shutters, and on the doorknob, I found several long, coarse, dark brown hairs caught in the metal. I carefully collected them with a pair of tweezers and placed them in a small plastic bag. I had survived. But this was no longer a hunt. It was a war of attrition, and I was on the losing side. The next morning, I drove into town. My hands shook so badly on the steering wheel that I had to pull over twice. I felt like a fugitive, like I was leaving a war zone. The normalcy of the town, with its tourists and coffee shops, felt surreal and alien. I went straight to the Forest Service ranger station. The ranger on duty was a young man named Peterson, probably in his late 20s, with a neatly trimmed beard and an air of bored competence. He listened patiently as I laid out my story, my voice hoarse and unsteady. I tried to be as methodical and credible as possible. I was a 63-year-old retired surveyor, not some hysterical kid. I presented my evidence. The photographs of the destroyed fence, the plaster cast of the bipedal, canine track, the baggie containing the coarse hairs, the detailed entries in my logbook. He examined each piece with a polite professional detachment. He looked at the pictures. "Could be snow load from last winter that weakened the posts," he said, tapping a photo. "A bull elk could have done the rest during the rut. They get crazy." He picked up the plaster cast, turning it over in his hands. He frowned. "That is an odd one," he admitted. "But you get weird impressions in mud. Could be a bear track that got distorted when it pulled its paw out, stretched the print. We see it all the time." He glanced at the bag of hair. "We can send it to the lab, but it'll probably come back as bear or canine, most likely black bear." He listened to my account of the siege on the cabin, his expression shifting from polite interest to thinly veiled concern. When I described the creature I had seen at the tree line, he stopped taking notes. "Mr. Finch," he said, his tone gentle, the kind you use with a confused grandparent. "You've been living out there alone for a while now. It's pretty remote. The mind can play tricks on you in the dark, the storm, the wind. It can make you imagine things." He slid my evidence back across the desk towards me. "My official take is this: you have a problem bear, a big one and an aggressive one, probably habituated to people. I'll issue a bulletin for campers in the area. I'd advise you to get some bear spray, make a lot of noise when you're outside. Put any food in airtight containers. But what you're describing, a 7-foot-tall walking wolf, that's the stuff of campfire stories." He gave me a pamphlet on bear safety. The official report, I knew, would read, "Unconfirmed report of an aggressive bear, advised property owner on safety protocols." My evidence was dismissed. My terror was rationalized away as the product of a lonely, aging mind. I walked out of that station feeling more isolated than I ever had in the deepest parts of the woods. The civilized world had no room for my reality. That afternoon, I called my nephew, Mark. He was my only remaining family, a good kid working an IT job in Phoenix. I didn't know what I expected. Confirmation? Help? I just needed to tell someone who wouldn't look at me like I was crazy. I tried to explain, stumbling over the words, trying to make the impossible sound plausible. I told him about the fence, the sounds, the track, the creature I saw. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Uncle Arthur," he finally said, his voice laced with a careful, hesitant concern. Are you feeling okay? You've been up there by yourself for a long time. Maybe you should come down to the city for a bit, get checked out by a doctor. We could go see a game." He meant well. He was worried about me. But in that moment, the final door slammed shut. He didn't believe me either. He thought I was losing my mind. I was completely, utterly alone. I ended the call, promising I'd think about it, but I knew I wouldn't. Leaving the cabin now felt like a death sentence. It felt like turning my back on an enemy that would simply follow. At least here, I knew the terrain. At least here, I could prepare for the next encounter. I returned to the homestead a changed man. The last vestiges of my old life, my old self, had been stripped away. The world I had known, with its predictable rules and rational explanations, was gone. In its place was a new reality, one governed by a single, terrifying truth that lived in the woods surrounding my home. My life became a series of defensive protocols. I drove into Flagstaff and spent a significant portion of my savings. I bought steel plates and bolted them to the inside of the door. I installed heavy-duty slide bolts on all the shutters. I purchased 4 high-powered, motion-activated floodlights and mounted them at each corner of the cabin, creating an overlapping field of brilliant white light that extended 50 yards into the trees. I bought a new trail camera, a Reconix Hyperfire 2, with a fast trigger speed and high-resolution infrared capabilities. My joyful walks through the woods were over. The only time I left the cabin was to maintain my new defenses or make a quick, necessary trip to town for supplies. I never went out after dusk or before sunrise. The Remington was never more than an arm's length away. Gus became a permanent indoor dog. The brave, confident animal I knew was gone, replaced by a nervous, haunted creature that started at every creak of the floorboards and spent his days staring anxiously at the door. He'd still let out a low growl sometimes in the middle of the night, and I'd get up and stand by the window with the rifle, watching the floodlights for any sign of movement, my heart pounding in the oppressive silence. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep became a luxury, and when it came, it was shallow and filled with nightmares of yellow eyes and splintering wood. I became obsessive, checking the bolts on the shutters a dozen times a night, reviewing the trail camera footage for hours every morning, searching for a clear shot, for the undeniable proof that I knew I needed but would likely never get. The footage was a maddening collection of near misses, a dark shape moving too quickly at the edge of the frame, a pair of glowing eyes visible for a single frame between two trees, the top of a pointed canine ear disappearing behind a bush. It was always there, just beyond the reach of clarity. It was watching, always watching. The joy I had once found in my isolation was gone, replaced by a gnawing, ever-present fear. I was a prisoner in my own sanctuary. Months passed, an entire year. The seasons turned. The overt aggression, the siege on the cabin, did not repeat. The vocalizations became less frequent, more distant. The foul, musky smell was a rare and fleeting visitor on the wind. A part of me, a desperate, hopeful part, began to wonder if it had moved on. If, for whatever reason, it had lost interest and left my small territory for richer hunting grounds. A fragile, tentative sense of normalcy began to return. I started taking short walks with Gus again, never going far from the cabin, always with the rifle slung over my shoulder. But it was a start. The constant, high-strung tension in my shoulders began to ease just a little. I allowed myself to believe that the worst was over. It was a cold, clear morning in early December, almost 2 years to the day since I'd found the first damaged fence. I was doing a maintenance check on the floodlights on the east side of the cabin when I saw it. About 70 yards from the cabin, near the edge of the woods, was the carcass of a large mule deer doe. That in itself wasn't unusual. Mountain lions made kills on my property from time to time. But it was the way the deer was displayed that made the breath catch in my throat. It hadn't been fed on. It was laid out carefully on a bed of pine needles, its throat torn out with surgical precision, but its front legs had been deliberately broken and bent into an unnatural, kneeling position, and its head had been twisted around, facing backwards, its dead eyes staring up at the empty sky. It wasn't a kill. It was a message. It was a marker. A display of power and intelligence meant for me and me alone. It was a reminder that it had never left, that it was patient, that this was its territory, and I was living here only on its terms. The false spring of my peace was over, and the winter of my fear returned, colder and more absolute than before. Which brings me to tonight. For the past week, the activity has escalated again. 3 nights ago, I found a single, massive track pressed into the mud by the porch steps, right where the motion sensor for the floodlight should have picked it up. But the light never came on. I checked the unit. The wires had been neatly, cleanly severed. The night after that, the howling returned, but it wasn't the sound of a single creature. It was a chorus. At least 3 distinct voices coming from different points on the ridge, calling to each other in that same horrible, guttural language. They were coordinating, triangulating. And last night, I checked the new Reckonix camera. I had placed it high in a pine tree, overlooking the clearing where the deer carcass had been left. I pulled the card this morning. It captured a single, 2-second video file at 3:04 a.m. The quality is grainy, the infrared struggling at that distance, but it's clear enough. A pair of eyes, glowing a bright, sickly yellow, emerges from the trees. They stare directly at the camera lens for a second. Then, a second pair of eyes, lower to the ground and further back, appears beside the first, and then a third, off to the right. The first creature, the tall one, lifts its head and lets out a silent, vaporous breath into the cold night air. It knows the camera is there. It's looking right at it, looking right at me. So now I sit here, with this tape recorder running, the logbook open on the table beside me. The silence has descended again. That heavy, pregnant silence that precedes the storm. Gus is not whining. He is not growling. He is lying by the reinforced door, perfectly still, his head on his paws, as if he has simply given up. The floodlights are on, casting a sterile white glare into the first few yards of the woods. But beyond that, the darkness is a solid, impenetrable wall. I know they're out there, the tall one and the others. They are watching, waiting, and this time, I do not think they are here to test the locks. I think they have finally decided to reclaim their territory. The tape is almost out. I don't know who will find this. Maybe Ranger Peterson, maybe my nephew Mark, maybe a hunter, years from now, stumbling upon this forgotten, empty cabin. All I ask is that you believe it. I'm not crazy. I did not wander off. Something has been hunting me for 7 years, and I believe my time has finally run out. The quiet is breaking now. I can hear a branch snap just beyond the light. They are here.